Okay, lots of no's, a couple yeses. Okay, a better question. Better question for this one. So here I'll just show this where I'll show everyone where this is in both edit mode and develop mode. And this is partially maybe why too, because it's one of those tools that's like very strong, but much like any a photo editing software, a lot of the tools are can be hard to find, or you need to know what you're looking for. So in edit mode, we're going to focus mostly on develop mode today, so we'll look at that as well. But I just want to point this out where this is, and we'll talk about it in a little more depth. So when you navigate to edit mode, there's a tool in edit mode that's called luminance and color range. It can be found underneath the select dropdown. Also Shift Alt P. And what luminance and color range is much like develop mode. It's a masking tool. And it's a masking tool that's predicated on basically luminance, so the amount of brightness in an image, um, sort of isolating brightness in this case to just the like 0 to 255 values. And then the other is color range itself. So color range, it refers to the hue and the saturation. So it sort of splits these values into two separate maskable items. So in edit mode, just to give you an idea, when you turn on one of these two fields, for example, luminance range, what it's going to do is it's going to showcase with a overlay. So in this case, we have this red overlay. Can everybody see that? That red overlay indicates the part of our image that is going to be selected when we make a alteration to this image. So in the case of luminance, what it's looking for is it's looking for specific mid-tone values in the case that we have here. This, if we adjust to these panels, these little boxes here, we can sort of isolate certain values and take them out of the equation. So by taking in this bottom slider here, which represents the, I guess, the sum total of brightness or the maximum brightness, you can see that the midtones that we're capturing, or the I guess the bright values that we're capturing, don't exceed 192. And in the case of luminance, right, in the base value here for the blacks and shadows, if I was to say move this black slider further into the midtone section here, so representing this center area here, you can see that now our range that we're selecting in the image basically starts at brightness values that start at 64 and end at 192. Or we can move these panels over and you can see that our selection starts at luminance values that are a value of 64 extending to 255. We can also slide these over and the same thing occurs. So now we have a range of essentially from a value of 1 or a value at all to which I think it's listed as 1 in this case because there's no true black pixels in this image. But and then it extends to, let's say 172 or something like that. So you can see that whenever we move these around, different parts of our image rather, is selected in the process. Okay, so in edit mode, and again, we're going to be largely looking at develop mode in this, but I just want to highlight where this is. And the tool is the same in develop mode. So this is not, it's not going to be reiterative. This is useful information. But within this luminance range field, right, we can then go on to make changes to our subject predicated on the values that we see here. For example, if I click OK, which is going to establish this, I guess, this overlay or this mask, right? When I click OK, the tool is set aside and we have our selection here. Our selection is indicated by this red area here. The part of our image that is not red is therefore not selected and won't be subject to adjustments. Now that we have a selection, what we can do is we can do a variety of different things with it. But if I wanted to just add a curves adjustment for an example, we can apply a curves adjustment to the area that we've selected. So I'll just do a standard S curve. So this S curve that we've applied here, if I just turn it off and on again, you can see that it's being applied to the area that we selected with the luminance and color range tool. Let's take a step backwards and just look at hue, which is maybe almost more important for what we're talking about here. So I just deleted that layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to select and luminance and color range again, and we're actually going to look at color range. So earlier I was talking about brightness. Maybe actually just to give you an idea, we'll just go into the foreground color picker for a second and talk about the difference between saturation, light, brightness, and hue. So, so in the luminance and color range tool, right, there's three different values that we're looking at that we're going to select in an image. The first one is brightness value. As we talked about, brightness kind of refers to blacks and whites, right? That's a rudimentary term for what we're talking about, but it's essentially the absence or presence of light. So to understand this, basically the brightness slider that we're looking at when we're engaging with luminance is engaging with this value. So we have this value here, and when I pull this further up, you can see that that brightness value increases. So a brightness of 0, and we can see brightness right here. So this is hue, saturation, and brightness, H, S, and B. When I increase this, you can see that that B also increases in value. The base value, or a value of 0, which is essentially black in this case, is no information, right? And then it slowly increases in value. So as we go up and up and up and up and up, we start to get into the grays, and then ultimately the brights, and then the whites. So a fully white pixel has a value of 255. This means that zero inclusive, that there's 256 values for brightness, and this will be also the case for saturation and hue. So let's just set brightness aside for a moment here. Let's not think about this. Let's think of actually hue in this way. So a value of 0 on hue, as you can see, is located at this very, very bottom point here in this hue slider. This right-hand slider represents the hues. Hues can be thought of as essentially like true colors or maximally saturated colors. In the case of 0, it's actually red. It's sort of like a red that doesn't have any pink in it. It's an orangey red. And as I increase this value, you can see that that slider and that value associated with hue increases. So if I set it right in the middle of green here, you can see that approximately green ranges from probably 70 to 90. And then as I increase it even further into the blue section, you can see that, well, cyan in this case, or I guess aquamarine, or however you want to call it, that ranges from about like 100 to probably about 130. And then as I increase it into the blue section here, you can see that blue probably starts around 140 and exceeds all the way up to about, I don't know, let's see here, 170. That's when you start to enter the purples, with the final value being a red that is closer associated with magentas than it is oranges. And that value is 255. So these values, once again, represent essentially the scope from 0 to 255. So those two things inclusive, we can see that there's about 256 colors in total. Or hues. Hues is another way to refer to color. The last value, and it's probably maybe the hardest to understand, but the value is saturation. So saturation, in this case, we'll set this back down to 0 just so we're starting from an even playing field here. So right now we have a brightness established of 0, which means it's fully black, right? And then we also have a hue of red, which is 0, which is just essentially this, in this case, this 0 can be thought of more as a color code than it is an incremental value. If we establish a saturation, let's move it up to let's go to 255. Because we'll look at this. When I slide this guy over to the right on a horizontal axis, you can see that saturation value increases. Saturation, much like brightness and hue, begins at 0 and ends at 255. So a fully saturated color exists on the top right-hand corner here. And as I slide this over, you can see that this value decreases as I move further to a totally desaturated color. Desaturated colors, especially the ones that are in this like lower saturation range, they look really gray, don't they? They have like almost a gray like quality to them, or the term that's often used is palette, or a palette color. And as you increase in saturation, these values start to become closer to what I'm calling a true hue, which is a hue that contains its fully saturated value, which is 255. This, of course, is the same for any color. So if I was to slide this over to the blue section here, so now we have a hue value, right, of 159. So within that 150 range, we have a fully bright color, so 255. And then as you can see, as I slide this over, right, this becomes more desaturated. So that saturation slider reduces. And as I pull this even further, it reduces further. So the purpose of this little detour, this tangent, first of all, I think this is a really valuable thing to understand and know, is that in ACDSee, and I think for when we talk about RGB values in general, so these RGB values, right? These are a sort of a way of interpreting and representing hue, saturation, and brightness. So we have these three sort of interactions that are happening. And when we're selecting and masking color in ACDSee, these things are going to be what we're taking into account when we're selecting and searching for colors. So in the case of luminance and color range, we can think of these as broken into two sections. So luminance and color range, I'll just exit the foreground color picker here, and we'll navigate back to select and luminance and color range. Luminance and color range kind of separates these into, I guess, two different values. So it takes saturation and hue, and those are interpreted as color range. And then it takes the brightness and it maintains it as the luminance. So the degree of luminance in your image. We've already talked a little bit about luminance. It sort of can be a component of when we're searching for colors, right? We can be searching for a particular color in our color range that has a certain degree of saturation, but also maybe we want a certain degree, pardon me, of brightness in addition to that color. Let's look at color range now and just talk about this. So in ACDSee, we have these two values. We have luminance and then we have this color range here. And all we can really think, the way to understand color range in this tool is it's a tool for selecting specific colors. These colors are going to be already present in my image. And as you can see, when I spin this slider around, you can see the presence of that color predicated on the degree that we see that overlay appear. So that, for example, I'm in that sort of red to orange tone right here. And you can see that this woman's skin is highlighted, and it looks like a little bit of the shadow on the background is highlighted as well. They're highlighted differently. So the one that is highlighted at the bottom here, this red section here, and these sections right here are highlighted only to a certain degree, like a very small degree. And that is evocative of the degree of saturation in that part of my image. So we can see that the areas that are highlighted with like a less strong red color here have actually a much, much, much lower saturation, but nevertheless the presence of this orange to red hue spectrum in them. Versus colors that have a much higher degree of saturation, as we can see in this woman's skin tone, face, hair, etc., and also looks like the bottom of her shoes, which have a much higher degree of saturation and therefore are selected in a greater degree of, I guess, red in this case, than the, say, the top portions here that are in the background. So what we've gained from this is some really valuable information predicated on a certain color range. So based on the color range of broadly orange to red, we can see that when I pull this slider over here, right, from say magenta, that these portions of my image are selected, and then the parts that are omitted in this case are not, don't contain that color at all. So in the case of the background, say, these parts of my background don't contain the color red. They contain another color or a combination of colors. When I slide this over to the blue section, you can see that her clothing, which is probably like a, I guess that would be the word for it, like a cobalt color and maybe darker blacks or charcoals, those are highlighted because they have a higher degree of the hue of, I guess, this blue to cyan range than the red range that we were looking at earlier. Um, Notice that maybe the t-shirt here, you can see that its degree of saturation is lower than that of the highlights on my person's clothing. So the highlights on this person's clothing have a higher degree of reflection, probably from light in this case, from a light source. And that light source is increasing the degree of saturation, and therefore they come through as stronger reds in this image than, say, the center of her shirt, the more desaturated portion of her shirt there. We'll just spin this around to red again. There's a couple more things to note. That's probably good. Okay. One other thing that's really, really, really important to know about, I guess, color in ACDSee and skin tone. um, so the way that skin tone is interpreted in pretty much every single photo editing software is it's interpreted as the color orange. And this is so when we have our slider in the orange spectrum here, we can see that our person's skin tone is selected. I just want to be clear that regardless of someone's ethnicity or like the region of the world that they're from, this will be true. So if someone has really, really light skin, it will still fall under the orange spectrum. And if someone has like really, really dark skin, that will still fall under the orange spectrum, barring any sort of post-processing adjustments. So in ACDSee, one of the things you can be aware of when you're making selections to clothing and as far as color come is that skin tone, especially within the orange spectrum, is going to be captured when we look at orange clothes. So this will just be something to keep in mind. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in more depth in a moment here when we actually talk about the masking process. Because masking a skin tone, or rather clothes, but not the skin tone, is a process that's going to require maybe a more involved uh, um, masking process. So it's not as simple as a point and shoot and go, oh, I want to change the color orange on my image, because it's also maybe going to change the subject's skin. Pardon me, I'm just going to take a sip of coffee here. Okay, so what we've talked about is making selections predicated on luminance range and color range. One of the things I'll mention too, this is relevant and important as well, is actually maybe instead of let's actually select the clothing in this rather than the person's skin. So we'll start with that as a base. So let's actually talk about this. The color range tool itself, if you've never used this before, is fairly simple. This interior slider here will enable me to actually move the hue range over. So this will capture new colors in this case, right? These right and left paddles can be moved further over or further inwards. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the actual hue range. So right now, this is a pretty broad range representing about an eighth of the whole hue range. So this is pretty inclusive. But if I was to move these further inwards, you can see that this becomes less inclusive, right? And less things are captured. Looks like as I reduce this, the shoes are not captured in the process. So there's this interior slider as well. So right now I have pretty broadly, it looks like it's selecting the blue range here. Let's see if I can capture a bit more of the shirt. That's not bad. We'll work with that. If I reduce the saturation slider, so the saturation is this value that begins at the center of our circle here and ends at the end of our circle here. Much like how we were looking at the color picker tool and we were looking at the saturation, remember when I was pulling that saturation from left to right, and on the left was the value of 0, and on the right was the fully saturated color, the value of 255? This works the same. So our center here represents our 0, and as I pull this outwards, right, our scope, our range changes. So in this small spectrum here, we have a spectrum that represents pretty saturated colors. And when we look at our image here, you can see that pretty much nothing is selected. So that means that all of our colors that fall into this brew range are actually lower saturation, not higher saturation. So when I incorporate those in, you can see that change. Inversely, I can take these high saturation colors and pull them inwards to not include them. Of course, if they were present in our image, which in this case they aren't. So you can see that our blue spectrum falls under that range. Let's talk about making an adjustment just quickly. So I'm going to hit OK. And then I'm just going to make a quick vibrancy adjustment to this part of my image here. So when I actually add the vibrancy, when I click on that button, you can see that that mask is used. That mask pops up. It's added to my vibrance adjustment here, and the mask is actually right in this little box here. It's telling us which parts of our image are going to change. Parts of this mask that are white are going to be subject to adjustment, and the parts that are black weren't actually selected during the process of that color range adjustment. So when we're interacting with luminance and color range, well, in edit mode at least, what we can think about this as is it's a way to make selections on our image. Those selections can be, in this case, color or luminance or a combination of the two. So when I actually go to make a hue adjustment on my image here, you can see that that hue adjustment changes the values of my woman's clothes. So by pulling it further to the right, it actually turns this woman's colors green. If I keep on going, looks like it goes even more olive colored, then more tan if I wanted that. And then to the left, it turns them, looks like a little bit more red. We can increase the saturation, and that will make these colors stronger. But as you can note, certain parts will become need essentially further editing because they become too strong and feel like a not well justified into the composition. But we can take those values and adjust them. So let's just take a pause here and just take a little quick examination of what we've covered, and then we'll actually bring this into develop mode where we can explore these tools in a little bit more depth without having the added complexity of layers, which I'm trying to avoid in this workshop. So basically what I've talked about so far is when we're doing color selections and we're working with clothing, we really need to understand HSB. We need to understand hue, saturation, and brightness. We're going to be interacting with these values when we make selections on clothing. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, obviously, when we're working with something like luminance and color range, we talked about luminance briefly. It's really just a degree of brightness in our image. But when it comes to color range, what we need to keep in mind is that this tool here, right, mimics the values that we talked about in the color picker. So the presence of hue and saturation are here. I mean, just understanding how they work is a part of the process. Okay, let's talk about color in this image. We're going to do a bunch of different changes to color on this, and we'll talk about the degrees by which we can get effective adjustments. This image is really cool and useful for one reason. This woman's clothing, actually both, but we'll just focus on the right-hand subject here. This woman's clothing color is blue. Her bag is also blue, but they're different colors of blue. So when we make color wheel adjustments to our image, right, or we mask specific parts of our image, this may or may not be one where the color will be accurately changed on both parts of this image, and we might need to actually address this using a different tool. So we'll look at this. Let's just talk a little bit about how we would change color in this image. There's two ways that I would look at this. The first is the color wheel, which we've already familiarized ourselves with. The color wheel in develop mode is a universal adjustment. We'll talk about it as a mask or a selective adjustment in a moment, but right now we're just going to look at the general adjustment. So if this woman's clothing color is blue, and I decide that I want to change the color of blue, I can open up the color wheel, and I can actually select the color of her clothing using the eyedropper tool, which will be default when we open up the tool. When I select her clothing, you can see that this dot spins around depending on where I navigate to in my image. And you can see that it's indicating where the hue slider will be moved to, predicated on my selection. So in the case that I want to select red with the eyedropper tool, you can see that my hue range actually moves over to the red value. Looks like this white has a little bit of blue in it, so that's selected. And when I navigate back to the blue section of this person's clothing, that portion is selected. Much like the color wheel that we were looking at, or within the color range tool in edit mode, you can see that the same tool has that same saturation values, so we can remove or select saturation values, and we can reduce saturation. We can also increase the panel size to incorporate other colors if we want to. And we can also just use the color wheel itself to move the hue range as we see fit. Okay, so we have this range selected. If I wanted to change the hue of this woman's clothing, I would take this hue slider and I would shift it. Pardon me. So in the case of my this woman, if I wanted to universally change this this blue color, and I'm not so concerned about the color of the purse in this case, all I would do is simply make a selection and shift the hue slider, or shift the saturation if I wanted to increase the saturation or decrease the saturation of her clothes, right? These values can be adjusted as we see fit. Now, one of the things we noted, though, right, is both her clothing changes and her purse changes. When one of the things I mentioned earlier is the color orange, right, in skin tone, and so I just want us to remember this when it comes to that certain scenario, because this general application change, the general change of the blue slider into the green or purple or whatever, right, also affected the blue that appeared on her handbag. So in the case of orange, right, if I change the saturation or hue or something like that of a clothing that's orange, it's also going to impact the skin of our subject. Because, as I mentioned earlier, skin in our subject will always be represented with the hue of orange, regardless of that person's skin color. So this is something where we need to learn how to separate these values. We need to learn how to split these two things. So this is where masking comes into play. So the color wheel on its own, super useful, right? Really useful for making a change to our subject, right? And it just so happens that we want to universally change the color blue in this case. But other problems emerge, right? What happens if the subject is her clothing is blue and she's in front of a blue sky, and we don't want to change the sky? Well, that would be problematic, right? Because if in so changing the hue, we're also changing the hue of the sky. Okay, so much like edit mode, develop mode has a masking functionality. Just to better understand this, all masking is it's making a selection of a part of our image, not the whole image, parts of our image. So one of the things we can do, right, is we can use the masking tool to mask specific ranges, and as you can see, much like in develop mode, or much like in edit mode, we have the luminance and color section here, which corresponds to the following values, right? Luminance looks at the brightness, and the color range looks at the combination of saturation and hue. So this tool, how do we think about this tool? This tool is has a much more range of abilities, right? We have, as you can see, the masking tool when we open it, right? It comes with a variety of abilities. So, for example, much like the color range or the color wheel tool, I can pull this value around to make a selection. So when I select blue, for example, you can see that the blue part of our image here is selected. So that mask that I see here, that red mask that appears, is just indicating that that part is selected and ready for changes to take place. So we can think of these color range controls as exactly the same as the ones we were using in the color wheel. The difference is we haven't actually made any adjustments yet. The adjustments live above the tool here. So Just to give you an idea as well, this tool comes with some refinement options. So what that means is feathering will increase the gradientiality from the outside of that color range. So if I increase these values, you can see that there is this halo that appears around the edge, and that softens the transition from the beginning to the end. Uh, Probably when we're interacting with clothing and color changes on clothing, this will be a tool you'll never use because you need that sharp, hard edge. Uh, Alternatively, we can shift. Shifting might be a tool that you will find useful. So shifting extends the selection range, right? As you can see, the range is located in red here. Let's change it to maybe green just to give you an idea. That's probably easier to see with the red subject next to it. But you can see that the selection range has extended past the edge of the actual color range itself, or past the color hue. So a value of 0 will represent the edge of your color, right? And then as you shift inwards or outwards, it will draw that selection and leave space or add space to it, respectively. So this may be useful when you want to address any like minor haloing that appears, or just to incorporate a fine edge on the outside of your selection here. By default, though, I think 0 is pretty useful. One thing that you may notice, though, for example, is there is a little bit of blue that appears on the edge here. Pardon me. And so something like shift might be useful, right, in addressing that problem. By just increasing this slightly, we can accommodate for that little edge problem, right? So even a slight increase to our edge of something like, a value of 3 will enable me to make adjustments to this section here. So there's another thing going on here. So our selection is I changed the overlay color to green. So that's what we're going to be making adjustments to. Let's talk about the adjustments that we can make. So when we're masking, we have these 3 tabs here up at the top. So this is quite a bit more depth than the color wheel on its own, which we had a little bit of access to saturation and hue and maybe like a vibrance adjustment and maybe an exposure. Oops, didn't mean to lose that. Let's go back to that. There we go. In this tool, we have 3. So we have the general application change, which kind of contains the same things that we saw in color wheel. We also have color EQ options and tone curves. So just briefly, tone curves is the least complicated. It allows you to add a curve adjustment so you can impact the highlights, midtones, and shadows. So by creating an S curve here, I can sort of pull more light into the higher end, or highlights rather, and pull more darkness into it looks like the shadows here. So that's me interacting with just the tone curves, right? So even just that adjustment on its own, okay, it's being applied to, as we noted, in this case, the color blue. So it contains the handbag as well as the woman's clothing. And then it also has a slight shift adjustment. So it's being applied to a little bit past the edge here. And we can see that. As you can see, that adjustment leaves this little white line here. So if I was to reduce that shift to 0, you could see that line reduced as well. Moreover, so the general application, right? Simple enough. We can add or remove exposure to a color. So this literally just adds brightness or removes it. We can hypersaturate a color or desaturate a color. We can add vibrancy, desaturation with vibrance as well. We can change the temperature, so I can warm or cool a color, or I can add a magenta by tinting it. I can add fill light, which is just a broad increase of light in the space. I can add a bit of contrast, which is kind of similar to what I did with tone curves, actually. And I can add clarity, which is going to make the pixels, the granular aspect of the pixels, kind of pop, almost adds a noisiness to it. In addition to that, I'm just going to reset these values to 0. And then we can talk about color EQ, which is the broadest in this tool. Well, the first being saturation. So Keep in mind that only the colors that you have selected using the color range tool are going to be adjustable using the color EQ section here. So for example, when I adjust green and I say, oh, you know what? I really want to see those greens even greener with the saturation, nothing's going to happen to my image. And the reason why is because there's no green selected. So blue, if I increase the saturation on the blue, you can see that that becomes unpalatably saturated. In addition, brightness. So brightness can be increased, but again, it's only going to increase in the values of the colors they're actually interacting with. So if I increase the value of blue, you can see those values increase. Hue is going to be a bit different. So hue is the ability to pull a color into a different range or spectrum of color. It's going to be tertiary colors. So meaning that blue in this case, the slider that we're interested in, it can be pulled into the green spectrum, right? Or it can be pulled into the magenta, I guess, pink area spectrum here, which are the ones that are right next to it on the color wheel. As such, it's going to change, the surrounding colors in this image, and it's going to become, it's going to change the anything that falls within that color blue. One thing to keep in mind is that just because our woman's clothing is blue here, if I pull this over into the purple section here, there might be some existing purples that are captured within this color range selection slider here. So if I was to pull this purple further into the blue, that might capture some of the purples that are captured within this color range selection. In addition to maybe there's a couple stray greens that are being selected and you can pull those. So when we're making masking color EQ adjustments to hues, I would just keep in mind that these other two sliders that are nearby, the color that you're adjusting, might also be worth examining, just in the off chance that anything gets missed. And then finally, let's see here. Finally, there's contrast. So contrast would take a color and we can pull either more contrast into the color or take away from it. And this is just going to enable me to interact with individual colors. Okay, so so we sort of understand now that there's two ways to make general adjustments to colors, right? So we looked at the color wheel, right? We looked at the simple adjustments. We had saturation, hue, brightness, contrast, and smoothness, which is essentially the same as feathering. And then we looked within the masking tool, with specifically the tool we're looking at is the range masking color function. But one of the things you all noted and could see is that we're still having problems addressing the issue of the bag, right? The bag was still selected during that process when we used the color range masking. And the reason for that is because the bag is the color of the clothing that we're interacting with. So in this case, we actually want to try something a little bit different. We're going to use the brush tool. And the brush tool, we're going to use it in conjunction with the pixel targeting that we were looking at earlier in edit mode. So in edit mode, pixel targeting is that tool that I mentioned called color range and luminance, or luminance and color range. And the brush tool within ACDSee in the develop mode panel has that same functionality. It has that functionality built in. In fact, actually, many tools do within this within this panel. It's just located at the bottom right-hand corner here, within the tools for the brush section here. This is pixel targeting. This is going to give me the ability to separate the handbag from the clothes. Or in the example that I gave, this would give me the ability to separate the orange clothes from the person's skin color. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use the pixel targeting to make a color range selection. And that's going to be blue because I still want to encapsulate or color the person's clothing, but I just want to omit the handbag. So what I would do here is I would take this slider, much like I did previously, I would just pull this into the blue spectrum here, okay? I would just leave it in. We'll leave fully saturated. The saturation level for this process doesn't matter as much. From here, what I would do, looks like I'm going to increase the smoothness. That's a bit better. Maybe increase the luminance as well. Mm. Oh, I might increase the tolerance. That's what I need. We'll explain that in a moment. Yeah, that's way better. Okay. So, blue. I'm going to change this mask back to red because it's easier for me to understand. But this red portion here that I'm brushing on is what my selection is. Um, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a brush stroke all around my subject here. And as I brush on, you can see that that becomes targeted or selected in this case. As I brush, you might notice that there's some sections here that I need to clean up, like for example, this area right here. But I'm just going to make a quick selection of the clothes, omitting the handbag in this case. I will address the handbag last. So when I'm making a color range selection, right, one of the things that's really useful about this is I don't actually have to be that precious about the edges because the edges aren't necessarily going to be incorporated because they don't fall into the color of blue that I'm working with here. And if they do fall under the category of blue that I'm working with, I can always adjust the luminance because I guarantee you that that blue will not be the same with both the clothing that I'm interacting with and maybe the background. For example, the sky that might be blue in my image is going to have a lower saturation and a lower brightness than that of the clothing, which will probably pop quite a bit more. So as a result, you could probably just incorporate the luminance range and then just make sure to omit the I don't know, omit the brighter or darker portions. So this gives you an avenue by which you can interact with that. I'm just going to go through. I'm going to make sure to finish this selection. Doing the best job I can. We can always touch up any elements that don't work. I'm going to go over this in a second with a better tool and just maybe omit the blue of her tattoos as well. So here I am, just about finished my selection here. So this is using the combination of the luminance and color range or a pixel targeting tool with the selection methods of masking. So there I have a selection of my subject's clothing. Okay, let's just have a look at this handbag and do a better job of this. So I'm going to zoom in a bit further. So in ACDSee, when you're making brush selections, you can use something called the magic brush or smart brushing. By turning this on, what it's going to do is it's just going to keep in mind the hue and saturation of the where your nib is selecting to do a better job of not over selecting parts of your image. So I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to reduce the size of my nib width and just kind of select around that. And it'll do a better job than I could with just a rougher selection here. Okay, let's just zoom out and have a look here. So this selection looks a lot different than our previous ones, obviously, because it doesn't incorporate the handbag in question. From here, I might make some adjustments. We'll just see. Smoothness. It just pushes the selection outwards a little bit. Doesn't look like it's going to impact the bag too much, so I'll just increase it a little bit. If I wanted to, I can increase the shift as well. So that's going to incorporate more of this section right here if pulled up. And then from here, what I can do is I can begin the process of actually addressing color. So in this case, what I could do is let's pull a bit of saturation into this color. I'll just hide the mask for now. Okay. Maybe I'll add a little bit of light brightness in here. And just even with that change, what I've done now is I've actually matched or very close to matched the color of the blue to the handbag, which is quite a bit different than our original here. Alternatively, I could probably move these further into the cyan spectrum right here and just change the color overall, or vice versa. I could pull that section in here, change it more in purple. Keep in mind that, let's see if I can get this. If there's any colors like this that aren't capturing it, let's maybe look at addressing some of these other sliders here. And it looks like that pulled, even just pulling in the purple, addressed a lot of that color issue right there. And then it looks like, okay, well, I might have over selected in this area. I bet you the reason for that is actually just because of the shift. So I could reduce this shift and it'll reduce the selection and the application of the color here. And I can always go in and just unselect by right clicking here. And unselect this bottom portion too, so that color is not being applied to the section at the bottom here. And this is a really obviously strong color change to this part of my image here, right? This doesn't necessarily need to be as strong as this. This could just be a light color adjustment, right? Or I could pull this maybe into the purple spectrum as well, which would require me, it looks like, to pull the magenta in to capture the neither. So by using the brush tool in combination with the color range here, what we can do is we can actually select the subject's clothing while omitting the actual secondary element, the handbag, which as you can see are both in the hue of blue, but one can be removed by being a little bit more selective with brush strokes. So on one hand, we have we have a tool like Color Wheel that adjusts on a very general axis. So all colors within the spectrum of blue with a corresponding saturation that you've selected will be adjusted. The same is true, obviously, for masking using, color range, right? Color range in this case is going to be quite a bit more in depth. However, there are some limitations, and the limitation is it's still limited by the hue range itself. So if you're still working in the hue of blue, then you're still going to be capturing other parts of your image that are blue. So in certain cases, it might be more beneficial to work with the brush tool in conjunction with the pixel targeting tool, which is located at the bottom right here. And by addressing or adding a color that you want to select and using the brush tool, that will enable you to select colors more discriminately than with maybe, say, the color range tool or the color wheel tool. And in this case, we can do a quick change of something like, you know, the color of this person's clothing within a color EQ range or hue adjustment. Can I turn that blue into yellow or any other color? No, not any color. So basically this hue range, right, is, I suppose, relegated in this case to analogous colors or nearby colors in this case. So when I adjusted to purple, this range of blue can be changed here. And vice versa, the sort of color can be shifted to green in this case, right? But that's the extent of this blue range here. What other things can we try? Well, let's see here. One of the things you could try is adding a color strength. Let's see here. I think, though, let's see if I can. No, the color strength is going to be applied like an overlay. Yeah, so that's not going to quite work. So the other thing you can try, obviously, is so when it comes to pixel targeting, right? Let's just rephrase this a little bit. The purpose of this color adjustment is to sort of separate that bag from the clothes here, right? But that isn't necessarily needed, right? For example, let's just reset this. Just by addressing the color itself, right? The color range, using, sorry, I think it was the color wheel here. The color wheel is capable of addressing, like looking at that blue and changing it to more of a yellowy color, right? So there is a bit more range there with just the color wheel on its own, but it is still limited in this case to, the range that ends with, in this case, it looks like ends with an olive green color. Furthermore, you could change the color of this to like a sharp yellow using edit mode and layers. But that sort of extends past the scope of this workshop because it would add the complexity of using like adjustment layers and masking in that mode. But that would be one way you could address and just change this to a really, really bright yellow. I just want to double check to make sure I'm not missing anything, but I'm pretty certain I'm correct here. But hue range, yes, in that tool, okay. let's see here. Ooh, can we supplant a color? No, that would be follow the same range tools. Color wheel. That's a highlights function. Tone curves. Okay. Let's look at masking range once more, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. So selecting the range of blue. If I make a temperature adjustment, it's going to heat it, but it isn't going to change the color. Color Q. Let's try something different. Well, let's pull the saturation into the blues here even more. Maybe brightness is fine. I think that's as far as we can go there. Yeah. Okay. Let's let's do something slightly different to answer your question. So in develop mode, you're limited by tertiary colors, so the colors that exist on the outside of that hue spectrum. Okay. So great question. Uh, let's see if I can adjust this in edit mode for you. So in edit mode, let's make a same that same selection. So we'll go luminance and color range. We'll do the color range selection of blue, just like we did in the previous workshop. Click OK. I could edit this out, but let's not look at that for now. We'll go to the vibrancy adjustment. Let's see here. Yeah, so it's orange spectrum. Okay. Let's do this. So what I would do in this case, Stone, is I'd make a mask. Okay. So let's just make that mask once more to showcase it. So I'm going to go to luminance and color range. I'm going to go to that blue section here. I'm going to save or make an active selection. Oops, where'd it go? Going a bit fast here. I'll slow down. There it is. Where did it go? Okay, well, let's do it this way. I'm going to take a mask. I'm just going to copy it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill a new layer with, let's hide this, with yellow, like a really, really yellow color. So let's say like canary yellow. Just going to fill this layer. This is a blank layer, Stone, and fill it with that color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this blank layer. This is, again, how I would deal with this in edit mode, which is sort of beyond the scope of our regular workshop today. So, but just follow along. I would add this yellow layer. I would do a layer mask. So I just literally click the layer mask tool right here. And then I would right click on this and let's copy, paste as our mask. So what we're seeing here is a really, really bright yellow overlaid over top of the blue in our image. Then what we're going to do is we're going to apply a blend mode of color. Yeah, not super good. Let's see, soft lights. It's so dark blue that this might take a while to figure out. Colors like screen is pretty too bright. Dodge is too bright. Overlay is too bright. Let's see, I don't think hard light, no, soft light would be too low. Color's pretty close, but then I think what we need to do is yeah, we probably need to change the base hue as well. Ooh, this would need so much editing in order to make this turn out good. That's like yellow, but it still has that faint tinge of green that I don't like. If I increase the lightness, okay. That's like near where I'm close with it. So I sort of sped this up a bit, okay, for your benefit. I'll just go back and explain what I did. So using the same tool, okay, so right out to answer your question, develop mode is not going to be able to do that egregious of a color change. It can do tertiary color changes. So just check that mark off, okay? Edit mode, you can do that adjustment. It's possible. What I did here was I took my image and I made a color range adjustment or color range selection, which, by the way, I'd have to go in and clean up. I sped through just to see if this was possible, but you certainly need to clean this up. So what all I did was make a color range adjustment, and I did a color range adjustment on the blue portion, so the clothing. Okay. From there, all I did was add a vibrancy adjustment. So this vibrancy adjustment, the purpose of this was to establish this mask, but then it's also to reduce the hue and increase the lightness of my subject here. Finally, what I did is I literally applied a yellow blank. I like searched for the color canary yellow, I guess, and applied it to a blank layer. And then what I did is I took the mask from the color range adjustment that I did, copied it, and applied it to the mask that I added to my yellow layer here. And by doing so and applying a blend mode of color, that's going to change the color to the base layer, right? It's sort of applying a layer over top of these other layers. In addition to, I have this hue dramatically reduced, and this combination of this color layer, right, and also the hue application will make it so that I could sort of change the color in that degree, right? Something that's way, way, way stronger than I would be able to do in develop mode. Just with note with the caveat that I really need to go in and I need to make an accurate color range and luminance adjustment, right? And then the other thing is I'd probably have to go in and manually clean up parts of this mask. And if this doesn't make any sense to you, we talk about masking extensively in other workshops, and I was trying to avoid it in this workshop, but it was a very good question, and it was related to what I was talking about. But it sort of runs or exceeds the realm of what we were talking about using develop mode in this workshop. So hopefully that answers your question, Stone Sculptor. I would follow those sort of patterns that I did there, but I would just make sure to really make clean masking adjustments while you're doing that. So yeah, that actually covers it today. That's sort of all that I wanted to talk about. Basically, we talked about sort of hue, saturation, and brightness. We looked at the color range and luminance tool within edit mode and develop mode. And then in addition to that, in development, we looked at two generalized adjustment changes. So looking at the color wheel tool in addition to the color range masking. And we found that those are super, super useful, but there can be a problem when you have two similar colors next to each other in a composition. And so the solution to that was looking at the brush masking tool in conjunction with the pixel targeting function as a means to make an accurate selection of a particular range of color here. So, and that gets around things like skin color and orange light, orange clothes, and it gets around like backgrounds that contain the same color as the clothing. And in our subject here, where we had a handbag that was the same hue as also our main subject here, enables us to address that as well. So that covers it all for today, folks. Thank you so much. I'm a bit behind on uploading my workshops to YouTube, so I will get those done and uploaded shortly so you can revisit these if need be. But that's covers it today, folks. If there's any other questions, I'll stick around for a bit. I'm just going to mute my mic so I can have a sip of coffee here. But that's it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you probably in the new year at this point. There's 2 more days left in the... So no, I will see you probably on the 6th. So thank you so much, folks. Take care.